Can you hear it? The pulse of our region. It's starting to sound like progress. It's happening here and there, all around us. We're gaining momentum and catalyzing change. But it doesn't happen on its own. We need each other. Every person, every business, every organization, we all play a role. We're leading. We're collaborating. We're growing. Yeah, we've had some wins, but we still have work to do. We're leveraging our assets, investing in innovation, and creating opportunities for everyone here to share in this momentum. The pulse of our region is strong, it's steady, it's rhythmic. Can you hear it? Can you see it? Are you a part of it? Every beat represents the commitment, the drive, the determination that is uniquely Akron. Our progress is palpable, but we've only just begun. We're gaining traction and building something powerful, something together, something greater.
Good morning and welcome to this morning's Leadership Dialogue. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our presenting sponsors, Huntington, KeyBank, Retzel, and Local IQ. I'd also like to thank our premier sponsors, including Cohen & Company and Summa Care. Thank you for your investment in our work and your support, allowing us to convene important conversations like the one we're having today. Today, we're going to welcome two leaders, Dana Brownlee and Dr. Deveny, to have a candid conversation about race in the workplace. This topic is critical to discuss. It's also multidimensional and it requires the ability to be open, honest, and candid about ourselves, the current state of our workplaces, and the roles each of us play in combating racism in the workplace. Over the last 2 years, in concert with the Elevate Greater Akron initiatives, the team has been working to advance economic inclusion. We've published the Inclusion Narrative, which outlines the state of inclusion and exclusion in this region. We've also developed tools and resources to help organizations and their people become more inclusive. While these tools and resources are critical, they revolve mostly around the topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion, concepts that are related to, but not the same as the concept of race and racism. To be effective and affect real change, we must be diverse, inclusive, and strive for equity, but we must also understand the history and fundamentals of systemic racism and the role it plays in our lives, our society, and our workplaces. We also have to have the direct conversations about the topic. Through these conversations, we're able to better understand ourselves, others, and the work we need to do to move forward together. This morning, our leaders will have a candid conversation about some of the most critical elements surrounding the ability to foster an anti-racist workplace, starting with what it actually means to be anti-racist. They will talk about the role of leaders and the critical nature of addressing internal systems that perpetuate exclusion in the workplace. And they'll end with a conversation about what's next for all of us who want to move forward and play our part to foster an anti-racist workplace. The Chamber is committed to the advancement of economic inclusion in this region on all levels, and we look forward to our continued work to support the individuals, professionals, leaders, and business owners with an interest in advancing this work. We believe our organization, our business community, and our region are strongest when we're all at the table, and we're honored to be able to bring the community together for a conversation like the one we're about to have. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Robert Dijonette, Vice President of Opportunity and Inclusion for the Greater Akron Chamber, to introduce our guests for this morning's conversation. Over to you, Robert.
Thanks, Steve, and good morning, everyone. Over the last nearly 2 years, 21 months and 13 days to be exact, I've worked with so many businesses and community leaders across our region as they work to achieve the diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts within their respective organizations. And as I reflect on these interactions, I'm genuinely energized and hopeful about the prospect of our future as a region. I see leaders stepping up and identifying ways for themselves and their organizations to be better. And we're working on holding one another accountable to the goals that we've set. I also see the challenges we face as a region, and I know that we have a long way to go to achieve the kind of economic inclusion and opportunity that I know we can and will achieve. But that's where conversations like this one that we're having today come into play. You see, the issue of racism is one that serves as a constant barrier to our ability to move forward. Sometimes it's overt and other times it's subtle. But I assure you, it's always glaringly obvious to the individuals on the other end of it. The truth is, all the work that we do in the areas like diversity, equity, and inclusion can not only come to fruition without an acknowledgement of race and racism and our ability to have and to hold candid conversations about it. Only then will we begin to break barriers and move forward. Today, we have two prominent leaders, both very different in their experience and perspective, while also sharing a commitment and a passion for changing systems, acknowledging barriers, and being really frank about the things we need to do to remove those barriers. Let's begin with Dana Brownlee. While I've only known Dana for a very short time, I have a lot of admiration for this young lady and the work that she's doing and her approach to conversations on the topic of race and anti-racism. Dana doesn't take a theoretical or academic approach to DE&I work. With more than 30 years of experience as a Black woman in corporate America and spending more than half of that time with a focus on leadership development and team building, she brings deep insight with a practical and relatable approach. She's the author of The Unwritten Rules of Managing Up. Dana is an acclaimed thought leader around managing difficult personalities, navigating challenging situations, and speaking truth to power, which are key strengths to being effective in this space. Dana is the author of several LinkedIn learning courses, including Essentials of Team Collaboration, How to Speak Up Against Racism at Work, and How to Foster Anti-Racist Workplaces, a practical guide for all employees. Her talks represent the nexus of her business expertise and her inherent passion to create anti-racist environments where everyone can thrive. A senior contributor for Forbes Careers, her business expertise has also been featured by CNN, The Wall Street Journal, The Economist, Working Mother, Entrepreneur, and other notable publications. If you are ready to take small steps towards big progress, Dana is the one that can help you. We welcome you, Dana. We're so honored to have you here with us today. Next, I'd like to introduce someone I've grown to know very well over many years. He's a leader, an innovator, and someone I hold in very high regard. Please welcome Dr. Cliff Deveny. Dr. Deveny, also known as Cliff, is the President and Chief Executive Officer of Summa Health, an integrated health system encompassing a network of hospitals, community health centers, a health plan, a physician hospital organization, a multi-specialty physician organization, research, and the Summa Foundation. Summa Health is nationally renowned for excellence in patient care and for exceptional approaches to healthcare delivery, a place where I spent 30 years of my life as an employee. Prior to assuming his leadership role at Summa Health, which was in March of 2017, Dr. Deveny was the Senior Vice President for Physician Services and Clinical Integration at Catholic Health Initiatives in Englewood, Colorado. After leaving Catholic Health Initiatives, he worked in Charlottesville, Virginia, where he served as president of Locust Health. Dr. Deveny is an Akron native, a graduate of Firestone High School. Dr. Deveny has deep roots in our city and our community. He serves on the board for the Greater Akron Chamber, the Akron Area YMCA, and the United Way Addiction Leadership Council. In my time working with Dr. Deveny, I can speak very frankly and firsthand about his willingness to affect change and challenge systems and do what needs to be done to move the hospital and the region forward. I am so thrilled to have both he and Dana here with us today for this very candid conversation about fostering anti-racism in the workplace. There's so much we need to cover today, and I'm really looking forward to this unique and insightful perspective from these two leaders. With that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Cliff.
We miss you, but we love continuing to work with you. And you taught me as much about life as well. And thank you for your leadership. And Dana, thank you for joining us here in Akron, Ohio.
Certainly.
Your great community, have a lot of rich history. And, we oftentimes are considered an underdog city, but we always are striving to get better. And we always want to learn, and we're a learning community. And so we're thank you that you're here today. So
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And we can hear you, so that's great. So for folks on the audience, I think the reality is this is a topic that we need to be very candid about. We need to be very honest about, and we need to be very open. It's an uncomfortable conversation, and it's one that created a lot of emotion. We saw that this summer with a lot of the protests and a lot of organizations stepping up and acknowledging that racism not only was a problem in our community, but was a healthcare problem in our community. And because of implicit bias, structural racism, and lots of things, we saw that people are being significantly disadvantaged in our community. And many of us made the commitment that we wanted to take action and we wanted to move our community forward. And as many of us know, our community continues to get smaller, it gets older, it's getting poorer. And if we want our community to turn around and we want it to be vibrant like it once was, we want to make sure that it's a place that our children, that our families, that others want to come to and they want to invest in. And so this is one of these topics that really have to be dealt with in a very honest and an open way. So with that, again, as a leader, I know we can do better. I know other leaders in our community feel the same. And so with that, Dana, thank you again for being here. But, all that's happened since the summer, there was a lot of talk. We went through the elections, and then COVID kind of overtook our lives. We don't see as much about what's happening from a racism standpoint, but it's obviously it's an everyday experience for many of our employees. Could you just kind of ground us in where we are in 2021 on racism?
Yes, well, thank you guys again for having me. I think it's really says a lot about your organization that you really want to have this candid, forthright discussion. And I couldn't agree more. We were talking a little bit before we got started about these are such big issues. And unfortunately, people can just be daunted by just the scope of it. And unfortunately, that pushes them into a corner of saying, well, I'm just not going to do anything. And that's what we can't do. We can't just kind of run and hide and not do anything. If anything, we've got to continue to talk about it, continue to try to carve out some progress in our little piece of the world. And it really does make a difference. In terms of where we are, first of all, I don't have all the answers. I don't know everything, but I can certainly share my point of view. And my point of view is that I think that we've certainly made advances in terms of acknowledgement. And I think that that is huge, acknowledging that there is a problem, acknowledging that there is an issue. Unfortunately, since George Floyd and Amy Cooper, which happened on the same day, Amy Cooper was the woman in the Central Park incident, and we all know about what happened with George Floyd. And of course, that trial is just getting ready to start for the police officer who killed him. But there have been other incidents, certainly, and there have been incidents that haven't made it into the media. Just last week, gosh, was it just a few days ago, the Asian spa incident happened. So we see anti-Asian racism, and certainly that's not new. Certainly that's been going on, even, pre-COVID. So I think that continues, certainly in terms of racism, that continues, unfortunately. The progress that I've seen is that I think that the George Floyd incident in particular was so egregious. It was filmed, and it's not the first one that was filmed. I mean, we've had others that were filmed, but everyone was at home because of COVID. Everyone was watching the television. And it was just so obvious and so blatant and so egregious. I think it forced corporate America, it forced a lot of society to say we can't stick our head in the sand anymore. We have to admit that we have a problem with white supremacy. How is this happening? Okay. And we can't continue to say it's just one bad apple. I mean, unfortunately, the truth is with George Floyd, there wasn't one officer there. There were several officers there. So why did that happen? It was being filmed. He knew it was being filmed, but it continued. So in terms of the reality of racism, I think racism continues to be alive and well. But I do think that we've made progress in terms of at least acknowledging that there is a problem, there's an issue, we need to do something about it. I think the question remains, because now we're almost a year out, what has actually been done? Where is the progress? Because obviously we've heard some of this in the past, maybe not to this level in terms of acknowledging the problem and committing to do more and to do better. We all know that it's a lot easier to write a check to a charity, for example, than it is to roll up your sleeves and actually get in there and do the hard work. And so that's where I think the disconnect is on a corporate level for a lot of organizations. We see a lot of performative anti-racism going on, meaning we'll maybe write a check, we'll bring in a speaker, and then we're pretty much done with that. And that's not really going to affect long-lasting change, to bring about long-lasting change. So I think that's where we're maybe falling down on the job, and that's why we're having the conversation today, which is awesome.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And I think your point is, if we don't invest in this, we aren't going to see the results and the return. So I think one of the things you just pointed is a lot of folks committed to diversity, inclusion, equity, at the corporate level, in their individual offices and communities, at the government, and different, organizations. But I think one of the things is maybe we get that confused, your point of acknowledging and being inclusive versus anti-racism. And so can you give us actually what is your definition of anti-racism in the workplace specifically?
Sure. Well, maybe let me back up. Before I define anti-racism, maybe let me define racism. There are lots of definitions out there for racism. I prefer two. The two that I prefer are racism is prejudice plus power. Okay. Many of us can be prejudiced. We have different prejudices. I might be prejudiced against short people or fat people or just all types of we have prejudices. But when you marry that with the power to disadvantage a group of people, that is where it becomes racism. Robin DiAngelo likens this, she uses an analogy with women, really white women, getting the right to vote in 1920. Many of those women prior to that may have held sexist views. They may have been sexist, certainly. I mean, sexism isn't just a male thing. Women, I'm sure, can be sexist as well. But did those women have the power to harm men as a group? And by and large, they did not. So that's one definition of racism. Another definition of racism that I like is David Wellman's definition, a system of advantage based on race. Now, that's a little counterintuitive because usually when we think racism, we think disadvantage. We think about the negative. But what we tend not to think about is it's really a system of advantage. It is the privilege. It's so we have a society where we're based on being white, you tend to have more privilege, you tend to have more advantage. So a system of advantage based on race. So those are two of my definitions of racism. There are many others that are out there, but those are just two that I use. Now, anti-racism for me is very simple. Actively working to combat racism, period. And I think the most important word in there is actively. Okay. And that speaks to a lot of the dialogue that came up after the summer when everyone started reading Kendi and How to Be an Anti-Racist. He said that, there's no such thing as non-racist. You're either racist or anti-racist. And by the way, he says in his book that he didn't come up with that. I mean, Angela Davis has said that decades ago. So it wasn't a new concept. So let me unpack that a little bit, because I think sometimes people get offended by that and saying, well, I'm non-racist, or, that's okay. What he's saying, or my interpretation of what he's saying, is racism is embedded into our history. It is embedded into this country. We've had 349 years of legalized discrimination, okay? We've only had 53 years of relative legal equality. So 349, 53, okay? So that's pretty imbalanced, okay? So it's very, very embedded. I know we're gonna talk about systemic racism a little bit different. So imagine you're on a moving walkway. If you're just standing still, you're just going to keep going. And if that's eventually, let's say metaphorically, the end is racism, you're still going to get there. Okay. Now, if you're running towards it, you're going to get there faster. Those are people who are actively racist. There are very few of those. That's another point. That's another bright point. Society has changed. We don't have the Bull Connors anymore. People, aren't stringing up Black people on the weekends. People aren't calling people the N-word in the workplace. It's not socially acceptable. So whether they harbor those feelings or not, they're typically not going to act on them. They're not going to say them. So if you're actively walking on that walkway, you're going to get to racism quicker. It's only when you turn around and you walk the other direction, right, that you're not going to experience that racist outcome. And I would submit, and I'm not the first person certainly to submit this is the bulk of what Dr. Martin Luther King talked about when he wrote his infamous letter from a Birmingham jail. The big problem is the vast majority of, you might say, white liberals, moderates, whomever, the vast majority of people who consider themselves non-racist, who are good people, who have Black friends, or who want to have their children to play with Black kids, all these good things, but they don't use their power, they don't use their privilege to change the system, to challenge white supremacy, and to actively work against racism. So that's why it's not good enough to just be non-racist. You really, really must be anti-racist if you want to see any level of true progress.
Yeah, and that's a great point, and we're going to get to that, is why people are uncomfortable or why they don't take action, and what are the different reasons for that. And what you really are speaking to is every American, in some sense, this becomes a learned behavior, and whether they actively learn it or not, it's somehow through the way they're educated, the way they're raised, the way their environment is. But what we have to do is unlearn this behavior, and to your point, we have to be active about it. So you have many business owners on the webinar today who are members of the chamber, and if they want to actively change the environment in their workplace, and they want to see the investment and the benefits of that, not only from a moral standpoint, but the ability to attract employees and grow, what's the first step that they should take to assess that? And our organization has 7,000 plus employees. What should I be doing, to actively find out what's happening in environmental services, or on 4 North, or in the chemo infusion center, in the emergency room? How should I go about that? And obviously we have all types of different businesses on the webinar, but can you just kind of give folks a grounding? Yep.
Sure. Well, interestingly enough, a lot of this you could tackle as you would any other business problem, to be quite honest, is first better understand the problem, first gather the data. So I would submit, gather metrics relevant to outcomes, and then look at what do the outcomes look like by racial group. So obvious things like, what does our executive leadership team look like? And, you know, how are Black people represented? How are white people represented? How are men represented, women, et cetera? You're in a healthcare environment. What do those outcomes? There's tons of data around outcomes for example, Black children or births with a Black doctor or healthcare. When Black people go to a white doctor versus being treated by a Black doctor. So there are tons of metrics that you can look at. Look at your vendors, your suppliers, look at promotions, look at recruiting, and you have to be a little nuanced with it. Don't just look at the raw number in terms of, okay, what percentage of Black people do we have in the organization? Where are they in the organization? And what does the mobility look like? So if you have them in the organization, there's one organization I'm a part of, to be quite honest, and they were so proud of themselves. They were patting themselves on the back because their racial numbers looked pretty decent on the surface, but they had no Black people in leadership. I'm like, I'm sorry, you don't get a cookie for that. Okay, I am not patting you on the back for having 0 Black people in a position of authority. All the Black people are concentrated at the bottom of the organization. So you want to gather the data, you want to gather the metrics, you also want to survey your organization. Send out a survey, ask them quantitative questions, ask qualitative questions. Now, you are probably going to have issues in terms of people being completely honest, but now with technology, hopefully people have a higher degree of confidence in terms of anonymity with surveys, but certainly bring in an outside consultant, bring in a third party to try to encourage people to be more honest with that feedback. But you certainly want to go out and you want to get the pulse, keep your finger on the pulse of what's really going on in the organization, get the feedback from them in terms of how do they feel working here? What does the racial climate feel like for them? Do they feel supported by their manager? Do they experience microaggressions at work? Do they feel as included as other people? Do they feel a sense of belonging? Do they feel that they have a manager that supports them in their career? Do they feel they have opportunities similar to some of their peers? So I would say gather that data, do the root cause analysis. Once you find that there's a disparity, do the root cause analysis. I actually have an industrial engineering background. And so I use those same tools that I used at the beginning of my career when I was a quality manager, when I was a metrics manager, say, hey, there's a problem here. It just as if you found any sort of problem in your business, do the root cause analysis to figure out what is the root cause underlying this problem. I was so heartened to just see on the crawler this morning, literally, when they were talking about the migrant children coming over and how there's so many migrant children coming over. And I haven't even heard the story, but I just saw on the crawler that they said that the government now is sending people to those countries to try to figure out what is going on in these countries so we can stop the children from running over here. You can't fix the problem here by just band-aiding it. You got to figure out what is it they're running from and try to address that. Same thing here. I use a technique called 5 whys, where I keep asking why, or you might use the Ishikawa diagram, fishbone diagram, but use these techniques to figure out what is causing the disparity and how can we actually change it or fix it.
Yeah, so let me just clarify one thing. So having a diverse workforce, diverse leadership team, being inclusive and checking all the boxes, you still can have an anti-racist environment, right?
You mean, did you mean you still have a racist environment? I think a racist environment. Yeah, I think you might. Yeah, okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. And that's what you have to be careful not to do. You have to be careful not to fall into what we call performative anti-racism, which is saying, okay, we're going to do a few things that make it seem like we're going to promote this one person. And so now we were a board of 15 white people, and one person of color and no Black people, but now we've elevated this one Black person. So we've addressed the problem. So you want to avoid tokenism. You want this to be a long-term effort. Yep. This should be a strategic priority. So if you want to ensure, I know one of the things we're going to talk about is accountability. So if you really want accountability, let's figure out how we can develop some goals that become strategic priorities that are measurable. And then let's tie it to compensation. Let's treat it as we would treat other strategic priorities for the organization. It's not just about throwing, Black people into leadership, randomly. Certainly when you hire people, when you promote people, you want to get the best people. So there is nothing that says that being anti-racist has to mean lowering standards. Okay, that's really kind of a racist premise. So you can do both, and you should do both. But the problem that most organizations have is, we're a little lazy. I am as well. I'm not necessarily going to step outside my comfort zone. I'm going to use the suppliers I've always used. If there's, nothing telling me to do something different, I'm going to go to the schools to recruit that where I have relationships, where I've always gone to recruit. I'm going to, use the same promotion processes we've always used. It might have a lot of subjectivity in there, but that's kind of what we've always done. So what we're talking about is getting away from just kind of doing the same old process system that we've always used to stepping back, gathering some data, looking where there might be a problem, there might be a disparate outcome, and then figuring out how can we change that process in order to bring more equity.
Yep. No, thank you. Now that's very helpful. I think one of the other things that we see with different workplaces is that the leaders may be actively addressing it. Human resources may be addressing that, but middle management or, on the front lines, what you're seeing is it's not being addressed because obviously people are bringing their lives to work. And so you see what we call microaggressions, and you see certain behaviors happening. And, as a leader of an organization, number one, what is a microaggression? But number two is, how do I address those types of things? Or is that handled through a code of conduct? Is there a way to create an environment where people, if they start to feel that people are, passively, being aggressive towards them or, using the microaggressions, is there a way for them to be able to address that and call it out?
Sure. Let me step back again and just share because the background is helpful. I want you to have the appropriate context.
Yes.
In my experience, there are lots of different ways to categorize racism, but I like to say there are three primary ways that I see that racism tends to show up in the workplace. There's individual, and that's where microaggressions, someone said something that was offensive, or someone did something that was clearly assignable to an individual that was racially problematic or offensive. They're systemic. So that's where it's harder to see. That's one of the reasons why that there's so much focus on systemic, because you can't really see it. You can't really say, well, Jim did it or Susan did it. But it's, well, one of our criteria to be on our board is that you must have been a CEO at a major company. Well, guess what? Very few Black people have been CEOs at major Fortune 500 companies, for example. So when you have criteria that ends up having a discriminatory impact, then that kind of feeds that systemic racism. Or we recruit, but we don't really recruit at HBCUs. We just never really have. Well, then there's no wonder you don't have a ton of people of color or Black people in your organization. So that's systemic. The third type is internalized. And so that is where Black people themselves might have lowered expectations. Or, we've just internalized this sense of racism. There might be racism within a particular racial group, or it might just be that person that is not seeing themselves as a candidate for promotion when maybe they should be. Or maybe they're perpetuating racism, but you certainly can have that internalized racism as well. Now, going back to your question about the microaggression, so I would put that in the individual category. Microaggressions can be lots of different things. It could be, a Black person making a presentation and afterwards they say, gosh, you really speak well, you're really articulate. And they feel like they're giving a compliment, and we feel like, of course I do. Like, what are you saying? Yeah. You wouldn't say that to him. Like, that's ridiculous. I have like 3 degrees. Yeah, I speak well. And or saying to an Asian person, you know, where are you from? Just kind of this othering, this sense of othering, like, and she's from, I'm from Brooklyn. You know, what do you mean, where am I from? But I will just share with you, just on a personal level, and my husband and I talk about this all the time, just being Black people, but also because I tend to talk about this, and we share this in common. The number one microaggression that I experience, and you can experience this in the workplace, but you can experience this in your day-to-day life, is just being minimized or ignored. Okay. Yeah. I think that many women have experienced this. I think that many people of color have experienced this. And I promise you, as a woman of color, I've absolutely experienced it. I've been in a meeting where a white man shook the other white man's hand. Like, we were all in a session for like a week. He shook the other white man's hand and just ignored me. Just like I wasn't even standing there. Like I didn't even exist. Or you're in a meeting and you say something and nobody really responds, but then somebody else who doesn't look like you says some version of what you just said. And now all of a sudden it's a good idea. I experience it in my personal life all the time, where I'm standing in line waiting. I'll tell you what happened. I was at a Marriott one time and I was standing in line waiting, and it wasn't, you know, there were white people in line, there was a line. And this white man just walked up to the front where the people were checking the people in.
Yep.
And just, you know, walked up and just, you know, wanted his service. And I got out of line and I walked up to the front and I said, excuse me, there's a line here. And at first he looked at me like, oh, like, you know, but then he was like, and he walked to the back of the line. Now, he wasn't doing that to me personally. It wasn't, you know, that's not, some people might say, well, that's not necessarily racism. That's, you know, right. But I think that there's this element, I experience it a lot, where you're just ignored, you're just devalued. My husband was at the grocery store the other day and he was just wiping down one of the carts. And this older white woman just assumed he was wiping it down for her. And just, you know, like, he doesn't have a Publix apron on. I don't know why you would assume. So she just went to like get the cart that he was wiping down. And he said, this is for me, you know, this excuse me, you know, this is for me. So things like that just happen so regularly. I cannot tell you. And I shameless plug, I recently launched a podcast called Real Talk About Race. And so I get together and it's real casual. I talk with my friends. I'm interviewing my husband next Tuesday. And I'm so excited because one of the guys I'm going to have on in, I think the 20th, I have to confirm the date, is one of my first managers, this white guy named Jim. And I love Jim so much. Jim would come to me and he was like, the Black people just get so mistreated here. He was like, it's just ridiculous. I mean, and I mean, it was just so amazing. It was so heartening to see somebody else. And that's, again, what is so great about this moment is a lot of this stuff we've been complaining about for decades. I mean, it isn't new to us. So when something happens on the news, me and my husband always laugh at each other, because when something happens on the news and it's like everyone's clutching their pearls, like, oh my God, how could that happen? And we're like, you know, Black America's like, you know, told you. So, so at any rate, I say January 6th is when white supremacy turned on white America. And it is egregious and horrible and horrific as it is. It just laid bare what Black people and people of color, that type of mentality, that type of violence, that type of brutality that people have had to deal with for so long. So microaggressions are just tiny expressions of othering that tend to happen. We talk about them in a workplace environment, but they happen all the time. They tend to either discount you, they make it seem like you're inferior, or they just ignore you altogether.
Well, thank you for that. And the examples, you know, they're real, and I see them in our organization. I see them, you know, in Akron. And so the question would be is that, so I think people are aware, but then the question is, are they comfortable having a conversation? And I think in many cases, people don't know what to say. Obviously, some people don't bring it up because they've been a victim of it. And then obviously, I think to your point, a lot of folks just don't believe it. And so they don't want to talk about it because it's not real. It's kind of like COVID doesn't really exist. And so the question would be, as a leader, how do you start those conversations? How do you have those tough conversations, and how do you introduce that into your, whether it's at the board level, whether it's in your shop, your grocery store, whatever. I think, the question would be is how do you get up there and bring it to attention rather than just letting it persist?
Yeah, I wish I had a great answer for this,
Yep.
but I like to keep it real. You have to be careful about having those conversations, because if you have the conversation and you're not the right person to manage the conversation, you're not the right person to facilitate the conversation, you can do more damage than help. So I think that getting an outside facilitator to help you manage that conversation can be really, really helpful. I also think that one of the main reasons why organizations struggle, and I've seen this, talking to a few organizations, is the level of racial literacy is so low.
Yeah.
The level of racial stamina is even lower. Okay. So in some ways, I feel like those are the two initial building blocks that you need to start to work on so that you can even have a conversation. Because I don't know if you've been in this situation before or not, but sometimes you can sit down and start having a conversation with somebody, but it's almost like me having read something about a chronic disease like rheumatoid arthritis or multiple sclerosis or something like that, talking to somebody who's had the disease for 20 years.
Yeah.
Like I can't even really understand. I can't even really have the same level of conversation. And we're not saying that everyone's, going to get to the same level of equality. Obviously, we all have different backgrounds and perspectives, and that's fine. But I do think that where it is helpful sometimes, because initially people tend to go to bring in speakers and book clubs and things like that. I think because they're kind of low hanging fruit. But I do think there's a benefit there if you read the right books, get the right speakers, and have some of the right education. I recently wrote an article for Forbes about how I felt Netflix's 14th Amendment. There's a docuseries. It's a 6-part docuseries that Netflix has on right now, starring Will Smith. It's narrated by Will Smith. And it's about the 14th Amendment. And it is amazing. So it is real education, the way you're not really going to get in most environments, paired with entertainment. And it is done so well. And so part of what we have to do is unlearn this Pollyanna fairy tale. So many of us have bought into this Pollyanna fairy tale. And I'm not saying this to be disrespectful. I'm not saying this to be harsh. I'm just being honest. And we have to get to a point where we're not being defensive and we're just owning our history, being honest with our history, and figuring out, okay, how do we move forward? I liken it to pollution. You didn't create pollution. I didn't create pollution, but guess what? We've all inherited it. So the first step is understanding how we got here and then figuring out how we can start to move forward. So all this looking back, and I want to make this point because I think it's important. Looking back and talking about slavery and convict leasing and Jim Crow, this isn't to beat white people over the head with how horrible your ancestors were, just to, because we want to make white people cry. That's not what it's about. It's about honestly understanding our history so that first we can have an intelligent conversation. Because if I have one set of facts in my brain as I'm talking to you, but you have a completely different set of facts, it's really hard for us to even have a productive conversation. And then the other thing is, is dismantling this fairy tale that I think it's kind of easy to buy into, to say, gosh, this is a great country. We believe in democracy. We've always believed in democracy. Yeah, slavery kind of happened, but it was like a bazillion years ago. It wasn't that bad.
Right.
It didn't happen for that long. And as soon as we figured out, that what we were doing is bad, we fixed it. And we've just constantly kept fixing things. And we got Barack Obama as president, and now everything's equal and there is no racism. So if you're buying into that mythology, we're not going to be able to have a productive conversation, because that's not grounded in factual information. That's not grounded in fact. So we first have to start with really being honest and open and understanding what our history is. What happened when laws were changed? Did white America say, oh, yes, now we want to desegregate? 54 happened, and yes, we're going to desegregate. Here's your bottled water. Sit wherever you'd like to in the class. That's not what happened. When they desegregated pools, they didn't say, oh, yes, here's a free towel for every Black person. No, they cemented the pools over and they said, we just won't have pools. We won't have public pools.
Right.
Just like Prince Edward County of Virginia said after 54, we just won't have public education. We'd rather not have public education than have our children sit down next to Black children. Now, that's a horrible thing to think about. Convict leasing, 80 years of convict leasing, where we basically re-enslaved Black people. They changed the laws theoretically, but then we came up with a loophole. The 13th Amendment said we're going to outlaw slavery except as punishment for a crime. So we're going to use that loophole to now re-enslave Black people for another 80 years, because we're going to say, you know what, standing out on the street corner, we're going to call that a crime, and we're going to take you in, and now we're going to send you to a mine for 10 years. So we need to understand. So that helps to break down the mythology that, oh, all we have to do is change the laws, and once the laws are changed, everything's great. When we actually look at history and we see what happened after the laws were changed, why the protest was necessary, how much resistance there was, we start to be able to, one, have more productive conversations, but then two, come up with better remedies, come up with remedies that actually will work, that will have an impact in the workplace and in broader society. So that literacy piece is really, really critical.
Yeah, and this goes back to the whole thing about the learned behavior, is that we have to educate people. We don't change behavior in our organization until people have a good understanding of it and they've got a context. And you think about all the social norms that have been changed over the last 50 years. And in some cases, it started in nursery schools when, smoking is bad for you. And the kids came home and questioned their parents, why are you smoking? And so the question is, how can we, get that understanding? And I like the idea, to your point, of getting people that are qualified to actually teach and get people to have a common understanding and acknowledgement in their organization. One of the questions we have is what is your perspective on the Black fatigue and white fragility books, and are they helpful in the DIE discussions?
Okay, so I've not read Black Fatigue, so I can't speak to that. White Fragility, Robin DiAngelo. Somebody else mentioned Heather McGee's book, The Sum of Us. It's actually right up there. White Fragility is up there as well. I think, I used to say I have my top 5 books, and now I think I've expanded it to my top 10. White Fragility would absolutely be in my top 5. I think that it's such an important book. It's such an important book. But it requires a level of racial stamina.
Yeah.
And that, in fact, when I did the podcast, my first 2 sessions of the podcast were with this white woman from Utah who wrote me after I wrote a couple articles in Forbes that sort of Dear White People. And so she and I kind of gone back and forth, and we're actually
I've watched that video. It's pretty amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. And so she kind of, the second podcast, she talks about her beef with Robin DiAngelo. And so, and I get it to an extent. I mean, Robin DiAngelo, for me, when I read that book, she put into words what I feel like I felt my entire life. but didn't necessarily have a way to give voice to. And I think that we all can play a role in this progression, this anti-racism progression. I can play a role, but guess what? There's certain audiences that are not feeling me. I mean, they're not going to feel me. They're going to discount me for whatever reason. There's certain audiences that she's going to be much more effective with. So, you know, I saw a meme on social media one day that said, you know, racism is so broad and huge, it's like a multi-lane highway. Just pick a lane and keep your foot on the gas. And so my lane might not be Robin DiAngelo's lane, but I'm so appreciative that she's out there. But I absolutely would recommend White Fragility for everyone to read. If you want to kind of get uncomfortable, it's a great book to help you get uncomfortable. But let me just say something that I think is so important. And it kind of goes back to, it's about white fragility, but it goes back to your question about these conversations. I think a core, key, fundamental issue in terms of real progress is getting away from defensiveness.
Yeah.
If we could all of us, just acknowledge we've grown up in a white supremacist society. Another amazing book is Isabel Wilkerson's Caste. If you haven't read that one, that's amazing. And she basically talks about how we have a caste system. We really do have a caste system.
We absolutely
white
do.
men are pretty much at the top, and Black women, Indigenous women are going to be pretty much, you know, towards the bottom. But we've all grown up. Again, it's like pollution. We didn't create it, but we're still, you know, ingesting it. So I've grown up in a society that's taught me to be male is better, to be white is better, to be thin is better, to be tall is better. There are lots of different types of, you know, betterisms or discrimination. It's not just about race, but race is probably the most insidious. So we've all kind of infused that, and it has impacted, this is the unconscious bias, it's impacted all of our psyche. I catch myself occasionally doing racist things, okay? I catch myself doing it, but I don't beat myself up, and I can have a conversation about it because I know it's not that I'm intending to do it. I know that it's because I have ingested this as part of the culture that I've grown up in. My husband, perfect example. I was watching TV the other day, and I was watching Andy Griffith, and he walked by and he said, "Oh, is that the one with the lady doctor?" And I was like, "Lady doctor?" I said, "First of all, are you 100? Like, what do you mean, lady doctor?" And as soon as I said that, he caught himself. He's not some like rampant sexist, but he had a sexist moment.
Yeah.
That was a sexist comment. This is something else that Kendi talks about in How to Be an Anti-Racist. He doesn't believe that racist is like some scarlet letter that you're wearing, like, okay, these people are racist and these people aren't. But he believes it's just a function of the culture that we've all grown up in, that you probably are going to have racist moments. We all do. So the sooner we can kind of just accept that, the sooner we can kind of move on. And that's not to bastardize us and say that we're horrible people and we're going to burn in hell. It's nothing like that. It's just a function of our society. Now, again, when I use that term racist and I say, you know, you had a racist moment, it's still nothing compared to Jim Crow. I call it racism 1.0, 2.0, 3.0. Luckily, we're in 3.0. We're not, you know, in Jim Crow and putting dogs on children trying to go to school and, you know, lynching people and all that. That's like a different era. But it still is that racially biased thinking that might impact our words or might impact our actions.
Yeah.
So
you know,
love Robin DiAngelo, love White Fragility.
Great, great. Well, I'm glad you brought up the whole concept of caste, because if you think about, our country was founded to get away from the caste system, yet we took it and we rebuilt it, and, you know, everybody's somewhat guilty of it, you know. To your point, you know, how you look, but where you went to school, you know, all those types of things. And you know, that's something that is very frustrating for me. So you had mentioned that, you know, having the right person to start the critical conversations in the workplace is something that is critical, but the reality is all organizations have a leader, and many of those leaders are probably not equipped necessarily to lead those conversations, but they are accountable. And if they are willing to start that conversation, they're willing to learn, what is the right way to, hold a leader accountable? How does somebody who says, I need to acknowledge this, I need to move forward, and we're all going to make mistakes, to your point. We're going to say things, that, are going to be offensive, probably microaggressions without knowing it for some folks. But at the end of the day, how do we get better as a leader? How do we move forward? And then where does the accountability sit in an organization to hold that person accountable, but also the other leaders in the organization?
Yeah, I think accountability is really important. It's one of the ways that we ensure that we're moving beyond performative activities and we're just checking the box and we're really committed to this long term. As I mentioned earlier, as we talk about leadership accountability, I think that two things come to mind. One, anonymous feedback. I think that you absolutely have to have an anonymous feedback mechanism. You really have to have that. I think that's very, very helpful. The other thing is,
and just going back, is it something mechanical, email, like a 1-800 number you can call? We call our safety line, where people can call when they see something clinically that's not right. Are you seeing that for this? Yeah.
And it doesn't just have to be one thing. Maybe you have something like that's from a clinical level. Maybe you have 360-degree feedback. A lot of HR organizations use that. So in terms of that manager's performance, they're evaluated on what their 360-degree feedback also looks like, meaning the feedback, it's a formal process that you use, but it's electronic, and a survey gets sent out to a range of people and they evaluate you. Or it could just be like a survey monkey that's administered, that's completely anonymous. Maybe you do it once a quarter. I work with an organization that has like a employee feedback box is by the elevator, and anybody can just drop feedback. I mean, that's pretty old school, but anybody can drop feedback in there. But I would just say have some sort of anonymous feedback. I'd also say, I mentioned this earlier, have clearly defined, measurable goals and have strategic priorities that are embedded into, most organizations have goals, they have strategic priorities. So have those and have them be embedded into the existing performance management system. Part of the problem is we look at anti-racism or diversity as like something over here to the side, and like, okay, we do that over here to the side, but then this is like our standard, how we run our business. Find a way to weave that into your standard performance management infrastructure. So there should be a goal or two that relate to anti-racism or relate to equity, and have that, because again, metrics drive behavior. Ensure that you're measuring that, ensure that that there are consequences for that it impacts that person's pay or it impacts promotion opportunities. And it's not just the individual, but you want to send the message that these priorities are just as important as some of these other priorities. But I think the two of those together are great ways to start to look at accountability.
Yep. And one of the questions that's pertinent to this organization and into our community is we talked about the moral imperative of being anti-racist, but can you give an example of just what is the economic benefit of an organization that has really moved the needle and become less racist or anti-racist?
Yeah, there are tons of economic benefits. Just right off the top of my head, I mean, there are compliance issues, there's avoidance of lawsuits. That's economically beneficial. I mean, not to be completely cynical, but I think that a lot of the companies that came out after George Floyd pledging their commitment to anti-racism, pledging significant amounts of money. Right. Now, let's think about this. This is the same money they could have pledged 10 years ago, 20 years ago. But what was different? What was different was the public relations winds had changed. And so now this is something that was egregious, that was in our face, that was in the media. And guess what? companies were scrambling all over themselves to get on the right side of it. Okay.
Right.
And one way to get on the right side of it is to pledge money. And guess what you do when you pledge money? You get a lot of great press. You get great press. And so one of the things that I was doing was, in my writing was I was looking at a lot of these companies that were pledging all this money. And I was Googling, because a lot of this information is publicly available, looking at their website, looking to see what does their board look like? What does their executive leadership look like? I was having people in the organization on social media I was seeing the messages saying, I can't believe my company is the one talking about they're committed to anti-racism and talking about all the problems they were having and how they felt discrimination was rampant. But so, those are obvious economic benefits. You want to be on the right side of this. But diversity brings better decisions. There are tons of studies that show that diversity brings better decisions. You are able to make more headwinds with different groups in terms of your consumer base. You're able to potentially broaden your consumer base. So there are tons of reasons why this isn't just morally the right thing to do. It is really the smart thing to do in so many ways. Not to mention the demographics of this country are changing dramatically. And so if you're kind of stuck with an anachronistic demographic in terms of what your company looks like and the customers that your company is speaking to, I think that that's certainly going to be a negative for you in the foreseeable future.
So one of the things I think you've highlighted is that when you start the education process in your company, you need to have somebody with credibility, and you're going to have 250 people calling you today to, get somebody who's credible, but we're not all going to be able to get Dana Brownlee. So how do you go about finding that credible person or getting somebody that doesn't come in and, in fact, take you in the wrong direction? How do you get somebody that your frontline employees, your folks who are feeling the racism that, constantly are feeling like, wow, we're starting to see some change here?
Thank you for that opportunity to give my next shameless plug, which is I've just developed 2 LinkedIn learning courses. If you guys, I'm sure everyone's familiar with LinkedIn, but LinkedIn has a platform called LinkedIn Learning where they've got really, really great thought leaders, experts on a range of topics.
Yeah.
I have a collaboration course that's out there, but I've just recently finished recording 2 anti-racism courses. One is going to come out second quarter. One is going to come out third quarter. The first one is how to speak up against racism at work. So it's specifically about that question of how do you speak up? It's like, I want to say something, but it's hard. I don't quite know how to do it. So a course specifically focused on that. The other one is broader. It is how to foster anti-racist workplaces. So it's that broad question about what can I do? And it's a manual for all employees. So some of that training is out there, and I would love it if you guys would look into that. Also, I saw someone ask a question about my podcast. How do you get that? If you'll follow me and connect with me on LinkedIn, that's where I share all the information. It's first and third Tuesdays at noon Eastern time, and I do it LinkedIn Live and YouTube Live. So I want to speak also to looking for someone to work with you. Let me speak to the difference, because this is a huge mistake. Please, if you haven't listened to anything else, please listen up, okay? It is a huge mistake in your organization to just assume that whoever your diversity person is, because diversity is not new. We've had diversity and inclusion for a decade, okay? To just assume whoever your DEI person is, that they can fix this. Or, okay, well, I'll just let them lead it. Your DEI person may be one of the least qualified people to actually have an anti-racism discussion. So let me unpack this. DEI is a broad umbrella of difference, both visible and invisible. Much like in medicine, we've got general practitioners or family practitioners, okay? So they deal with like cradle to grave. Okay, very inclusive. It is a very broad umbrella, and it's necessary and it is important. So I'm not demonizing it in any way. Very necessary, important. Anti-racism is a very specific area, okay, that I would submit has been long ignored by DEI, sometimes intentionally and sometimes unintentionally, okay? So the mistake, so for example, so if I get diagnosed with cancer, I'm not gonna keep asking my general practitioner to treat me. They're gonna send me to an oncologist, okay? So similarly, you need to have an anti-racism expert or consultant to help you navigate these conversations. And the reason why I illuminate this, several reasons. One, let's look at how long we've been doing DEI and let's look at the outcomes. Okay. Right. If DEI was helping address racism and helping us get to where we needed to be, we wouldn't only have 4 or 5 Black people in 4 or 5 Black CEOs in the Fortune 500 today. Okay. And actually, I think it's 4 because the woman who just got announced for TIAA, she's not starting until May 1st. But Roz Brewer, I think, who is my alum from Spelman, I think she's already started. So I think we've got 4. That's less than 1%. Okay, less than 1%. So we can look at the outcomes. Now, in your organizations, you can also look at your own metrics. You can look at your own outcomes. But let me talk about something that's even more insidious that most people are not going to talk about. Okay, because DEI is so broad, you have a variety of different people who are DEI leaders. You have members of the LGBT community who are DEI leaders. You might have a person of color who's a DEI leader. You might have women who are DEI leader. And then what tends to happen, this has been my personal experience, and this is what I've read a lot of times in the literature. You can have someone with very low racial literacy, very low racial stamina. And so what they do is, unfortunately, they can contribute to the problem more than help the problem. When I was in corporate, I would go to diversity classes, and guess what that the teacher would do, the person who was the DEI expert, a lot of times they would start off by saying, we want you to know that DEI is so much more than race and gender. It's so much more than race and gender. And so guess what that person continue to do for the rest of the day is ignore race and gender. They focus on disability, they focus on LGBT, they focus on inclusion in terms of your work style, whether you're an introvert or an extrovert. They talk about all these other areas, which are important. I want to make that point. These are important areas. But when you keep skipping over, we're going to skip over the race discussion because guess what? That's the uncomfortable conversation. That's not what they want to talk about. Let's say it's a white woman with not a terribly high level of racial literacy, not a terribly high level of racial stamina. She's not going to jump in to that race conversation. And I'm not saying you have to have a Black person. Again, we talked about Robin DiAngelo. She's an amazing authority on this topic. But I'm just talking about what happens day in and day out in corporate environments. They pick the DEI person and assume that that's the person to lead the anti-racism conversation. And my experience has been oftentimes that might be the last person that you want to lead the anti-racism discussion. So I just want to close by saying you need both. You need DEI, but you also need anti-racism.
Yeah, and to your point, you can't delegate that. As a leader, you really have to own it, and you've got to understand the investment that's needed for that going forward. Couple of questions from the audience, and I really want to thank everybody for all the comments. We have well over 150 comments, and I really appreciate that. One of the questions is there a code language that can be identified as racist in our work places?
I'm not sure I 100% understand the question, but I think it's funny. I'm reading a book now called Racism. I'm turning my phone on to get the right word. I think it's called Racism Without Racist. Really, really good book. So that's another one that I would recognize. And I think what this question is speaking to is what I talked about before, like racism 1.0, racism 2.0, racism 3.0, meaning you're very rarely going to see explicit like language that says, hey, we don't hire Black people. I mean, you can't do that. That's illegal. So you're not going to see that. But what you will see is criteria that disadvantages a particular group or has a negative disparate impact on a particular group. So yes, I do think that you see that. You see there are euphemisms for it. And in fact, there's a video, God, I wish I could, his name is escaping me. There's a, I don't want to call a name if it's not the right person. But at any rate, there's a video that's out there of one of
We'll get it for the audience. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, of one of Ronald Reagan's advisors, and it's a famous name. And he says it's a hot mic situation, and he says on there, you can't say N-word, N-word, N-word anymore. You can't say that. So what you say is states' rights. So he's like, he was literally giving him the code words that you could say. Or you could say better schools. We're not going to say, Black neighborhood. We'll just say the better schools. So yes, I think certainly there are euphemisms, there's code words, there are things like that. But this book that I'm reading is a great one, Racism Without Racist. And he's basically talking about that, how you still end up with the racist impact. But of course, everyone says I'm not a racist. Got
it. One of the questions was, can microaggressions be displayed by individuals from within the same race? And I think when you take your definition of racism, of prejudice and power, I think the answer is yes, right?
Absolutely. Yes. And that's also that internalized racism that I talked about. I wrote an article about Black men, the dearth of Black male doctors in America on Forbes. And I had a Black male doctor email me this week, and he's currently practicing, I think, in the state of Indiana. And he proceeded to talk about how Black mothers don't have expectations of their sons, and Black men are horrible role models, and they're all on drugs, and they're all in jail. So it's really, really sad. It's a sad thing to read and to hear. But absolutely, there are Black people, there are people of all races who hold biased views. There are people of all races who have lowered expectations. There's a term that we used to have, well, I shouldn't say used to have in the Black community, where you get frustrated with Black people and say, they think the white man's ice is colder, and that's the truth. There was a Sanford and Son episode that I loved, and where Fred was going in to get his teeth worked on, and this Black guy came in to work on him, and he said, no, I don't want you. I want somebody else. So then the white guy came on and looked at him. He said, yeah, this is so complicated. I'm going to have to get the head of our department. I'm going to get the head of our department. And then it was the first Black guy. So the Black guy came back. He was the head of the department. But again, there's this psyche that says, I want the white man's ice is colder. I want, the white person's going to be smarter, better, faster. So absolutely, yes. And somebody mentioned colorism. Colorism is, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the term, but it's within a particular race where you look at literally the color of a person, because obviously Black people can, cover a wide range of different hues and colors. But within, and it's not just within Black people. I think, East Indians have struggled, with this as well. It's well documented in a lot of different ethnic groups where there's preference for lighter skin, and there's a significant benefit for lighter skin. And in Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, she didn't just look at the caste system in the United States. Of course, she looked at India. She looked at not the Nazis. She looked at lots of other societies, and yes, very true that you can. It's not just a white thing. I mean, Black people certainly can have racist views and biased views as well.
Got it. So Akron has a very significant immigrant population that has come to to our community over the last 25, 30 years. And what one of the questions we have is, since I'm a 20th century immigrant and my folks, my family, we didn't enslave Black people, what's our accountability? What's our responsibility towards this? And in some sense, how do you acknowledge their experience and the trauma they've gone through as an immigrant? And is there any parallels there? Because we have a huge immigrant population in our corporation, and I'm sure they feel, the microaggressions and the biases and all those types of things as well. But
yeah.
So.
And this has been in the news a lot, not in the exact same way as the way you're posing it, but with the anti-Asian hate that's been going on.
Yeah.
And the racism that Asian people have experienced for, for decades, centuries, really. So yeah, and this is one of the reasons why I love that Netflix series, the amendment, the 14th Amendment. 3 of them deal with Black-white racism and the history from slavery. Then I think there's one that relates to women's rights. There's one that relates to LGBTQ. And then the last one deals with immigrants and immigrant rights and the history there. So again, I think that just really understanding the history is really important. And I think we also have to get away from this trauma competition. Like, it's not a competition. There's been a ton of racism and honestly, the bedrock, the common point is white supremacy. I mean, yeah. It's that white supremacist society and that white supremacist culture. So there's not a competition between the racism that we experience as Black people versus what a lot of Asian people have experienced and a lot of other immigrants have experienced. But it's just, we live in a culture that prioritizes being male, it prioritizes being white. And unfortunately, the closer you are to that, arguably the more benefit you have received. But I think that we need to get to a point where we're not also focused on assigning blame, because it's not, again, about blaming people. Like, I didn't create it, you didn't create it, but it's about understanding it. Because the first step of fixing any problem is acknowledging it. There's a reason why in the 12-step process, that first step is admitting that there is a problem.
Yes.
Okay?
Yep.
And that's where I do feel like we have made some progress. So it's not about blaming and about saying, you did it or your ancestors, but it's about understanding it so we can figure out what can we do to unravel it and make it better moving forward. Because honestly, there are people who are very well-intentioned, who don't realize what they're doing. And that's why having the conversation and building the relationships is so important.
Well, and I think to your point, the natural defensiveness and somehow creating an environment where people can feel it's a safe environment and they can actually have those conversations, not only in the educational sessions, but in the workplace going forward. One of the questions is you touched on it, and I think you did a nice job, but just can you elaborate more on what performative anti-racism is? Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. So performative anti-racism is when we're taking actions to feel like we're making a difference or to be able to show that we did something, but we're not really invested in it in a long-term way. So I'll give you an example. If you have an organization where, let's say, Black people are very underrepresented in senior levels of leadership, or there's some other metrics that suggest that there's disparate impact, or there might be discrimination. They might bring in a speaker and they might say, you know what, because we're so committed to anti-racism, we're going to have a speaker come in once a month. And we're going to have them come and talk about anti-racism. Okay. Is there benefit to having a speaker come in once a month? Yes, there's some benefit. That's better. It's better to do, assuming they're good speakers, assuming they're good quality anti-racism speakers. But that's something where you could check the box and you can send stuff out on social media. You can, develop these glossy marketing materials that show the speaker and what you're doing and take pictures and all that good stuff. But is that going to fundamentally change the environment in that organization?
Right.
Probably not. I mean, there might be some benefit, I would hope, if they're good speakers. But if they really have some deeply embedded issues in terms of, okay, what their suppliers look like, what their promotion processes look like, what their executive leadership team looks like in terms of those demographics, what type of visibility some of the Black leaders have, the influence that they have within the organizations, where they're recruiting from, even the imagery, their website, their messaging, all of that. Just bringing a speaker in isn't going to fix all that. So performative anti-racism is really where people are not necessarily invested in terms of making real substantive change. They just want to kind of window dress. It's like window dressing.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to coming up with metrics that are meaningful, measuring those, being transparent with those within the whole organization, but also externally when you're a large publicly nonprofit, we have an accountability to put everything out there. And I think that's an important thing. But to your point, I think people do check the boxes and then go on with everything else that they've got, but are they making meaningful change? So we have just about 5 minutes for final questions. One of the questions we have is, could you explain white privilege to white people that do not understand how they have benefited from it?
Thank you for that question. That is an awesome question. Yes. So I think that people misunderstand white privilege to think that it means that all white people are privileged in terms of they're all wealthy or they didn't have to work their way through college. Life was easy for them. We're not saying that. What white privilege means is that for white people, you've arguably never been in a position where your whiteness hurt you.
Right.
You've never been in a position where your whiteness held you back. Okay. So whether you realize it or not, you've benefited from that. And to be honest, all of us have some sort of privilege. Guess what? How many of you are right-handed? Okay. How many of you right-handed? Okay. Well, guess what? You've had privilege.
Yes.
Because when I would talk to my aunt who was left-handed, all she would complain about, she's like, this whole world is made for right-handed people. It makes me so sick. I wish they need left-handed scissors. They need left-handed this, left-handed that. And it's like, guess what? I never thought about that. I never for 2 seconds thought about the fact that when I would sit down, the chairs were all, made for right-handed people, and I would get my scissors and I would get my pen and my keyboard. Everything is made for right-handed people. So it's not something that it means that it shouldn't be viewed as a negative. It's just we've grown up in a society where to be white in this society has not held you back. It has not been a disadvantage. I promise you, as a white parent, I want you to think about this. As a white parent, have you worried that when you sent your child to school and they had to learn about physicists and authors and scientists, have you ever worried that your race would not be well represented? Have you worried about that? Okay. When you're sitting in meetings for white people who are out there, think about the thousands of meetings that you've been in, thousands of meetings that you've been in. Assuming the meeting was not on the topic of race or some sort of racial group, just regular meetings. What percentage of those thousands of meetings would you say that you participated in where you were the only white person? What percentage? How often have you gone up for a promotion? Or how often have you interviewed for a job and worried that your race might have a negative impact or negatively impact you? Okay. That generally just isn't a potential negative factor. And, you know, I have a saying, and I remember being in business school. I went to business school at Emory, and it's amazing how twisted some of this gets. This white guy was sitting behind me. We're in a group of about 70 people, and we were like in an employment law class. And so I guess he was bitter because he had just been passed over for a promotion or something like that. And he was like, yeah, and I didn't get that job, and they gave it to a Black woman. And I turned around and I was like, maybe she was more qualified. Maybe she was a better candidate.
Right.
You know, we have to stop associating Black and or female with inferior. And it's like this assumption that I should always get it. And
Right.
somehow we don't have that assumption. I have a quote that I put out on social media sometimes. It says, you know, just because I beat you in a race doesn't mean you didn't have a head start. Okay? Doesn't mean that. Because people like to look at Obama. Obama is like one of the most amazing, brilliant people on the planet. And so because Obama won, somehow, you know, it means racism no longer exists. No, white privilege is still there, but he was just that amazing. He was just that amazing. So hopefully I explained what white privilege is.
You did a great job, and the reaction from the audience is pretty amazing. So I want to thank you just for your insights and just you spending time with all of us here in Akron, Ohio. You're an amazing person. You bring this down to just kind of a, you know, comfortable level. We can just have that conversation. That's what I love about your videos and everything else, is that you're not an academic person that's lecturing to us. You know, you're giving real life examples, and that's how we learn. And I know as a leader, this is something that we're committed to, I'm committed to, and we're all committed to in our community. One of the common things we're getting is, how do we follow up from here? Are there other resources? Are there other things that I can get? And I know the Greater Akron Chamber is going to make those available. Robert is going to push those out to everybody so we can continue this. This is not a one and done as an organization. So I want to acknowledge that. So I just want to thank everybody who's participated today and engaged with us. I've never seen so many comments, so many questions, and I'm going to kick it back to Steve. And again, thank you, Dana.
Thank you. And as he goes back, I'll just say that please follow me on LinkedIn and Forbes and connect with me on LinkedIn. I share most information that way. And I'm happy to share, I saw the question about resources. I'm happy to share my recommended book list as well. But thank you guys for having me.
Great. Thank you so much.
Dana, Cliff, thank you so much for the time you spent this morning. There's nothing pithy I can say after that. It was really frank conversation. I appreciate you both being willing to sort of dive into the details. Dana, I did want to push again the LinkedIn Learning Lab as well for folks, because I think that'd be a great resource. But thank you for what you did this morning. We really appreciate both of you. Right.
Have a great day, everybody.
As you both alluded to, there's a lot that we've got to still do. So think about the steps that you can take. We're providing resources through the Chamber to help organizations, whether it be our inclusion assessment or their inclusion marketplace. There's also a link in the chat that will take you to more information about those tools. So if they could be helpful to your organization, we'd love to have you take a look at those. I think if you've got ideas or you have thoughts or comments or suggestions for us, talk to me, talk to Robert, talk to Andre Thornton or Nick Browning, who lead our opportunity inclusion work for the board. We appreciate our sponsors today for helping us do today's event, Huntington, KeyBank, Retzel, and Local IQ. Also our premier sponsors, including Cohen & Company and Summa Care. Thanks for your investment in our work and your ongoing support, allowing us to convene these kinds of conversations like we had today. Finally, a couple just quick notes as we look ahead into April. I hope to see you at our next virtual leadership dialogue on April 16th, where we're going to have a stellar panel talking about the work of the future, the role of technology in work, and the shifting nature of how we're adapting to find and develop talent with the in-demand skills to meet our needs as employers. And on April 30th, we're going to hold GAC's annual meeting. I'm hoping it's the last virtual annual meeting we'll have to do for a long time. But in addition to hearing a quick update on some of our work and doing some of our board and member business, we'll also look forward a little. We're going to welcome Brian Solis, literally a world-renowned digital anthropologist and futurist, for a candid conversation about business revolution and new leadership as he shares his perspectives on concepts like digital Darwinism, digital transformation, the importance of leadership to drive change forward. He is the global innovation evangelist at Salesforce and an anytime best-selling author, international keynote speaker. He's also been called by Forbes one of the most creative and brilliant business minds of our time. He's going to join us from the West Coast, so it'll be fun to have him in that. And the start time for that is a little bit later, about 11 o'clock or so, again on April 30th. Sorry. So attendees will have the opportunity to ask questions and also a chance to get a copy of one of his books, X, The Experience Where Business Meets Design. So I hope to see you at one of these upcoming events or maybe around town. Thanks for your participation today. And I look forward to seeing you all at something coming up soon. Have a great day.